everyone, you're listening to Opinion Science, the show about our opinions, where they come from, and how we talk about them. I'm Andy Luttrell, and right now, as this episode bursts forth onto the internet, I am somewhere in the UK. I've been traveling for a little bit, which has been great, but also I didn't plan really well, so I didn't have time to research, write, and record a full intro to this week's episode like I usually do. But no worries, because the main event is so good. I'm excited to share my conversation with Hussein Wheeler. He's a professor of management and marketing at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and back in the day, he was a grad student in Rich Petty's lab at Ohio State, which is where I eventually landed too. So we've run into each other plenty of times over the years, and I'm always excited to see him. As you'll hear, his story is interesting because he made the move from psychology to a business school at a time when that wasn't super common. So I pick his brain a little bit about how teaching life is different in that environment. He's also been really interested in improvisational theater, which has worked its way into his professional life, too, and I was curious to get the scoop on that. And then, of course, he continues to tackle interesting questions in his research work, and he shares some very new findings about how people perceive other people's reputations. This includes whether people admire other people who have a lot of self-control, and whether they admire people who are receptive to a variety of viewpoints. So, let's get to it. The first thing I was thinking of in terms of like the Hussein Wheeler story is that you're, to me, like one of the first instances of someone who did this jump from social psych to business, I think at a time where that wasn't super common. So plenty of social scientists will listen to this show and know kind of what that road looks like now. But even outside of academia, I don't know like how intuitive it seems that like a trained social psychologist would reasonably end up in a business school.
Yeah.
Especially when that was like not like there was no playbook, I don't think, at the time you did that to do that. So how did you do it and why?
Oh, yeah. Well, so as you know, people who go to Ohio State in social psychology have to have two minor emphases, right? And most, at least when I was there, most social psychologists had quantitative psychology as their major minor, and then they did various other things as their minor. And so what I did as my minor was to take marketing classes. And so I had exposure to the people over there, one of whom actually was a Petty student as well, Kurt Haukbet. And so I had always had in the back of my mind that marketing would be something that was interesting, and marketing obviously is a domain of persuasion application, at least part of it is. And so I had always had that in my mind. And when it came closer to the job market, that was something I was considering. And I had a chance encounter with another former Petty student who had gone into marketing, Joe Priester. And he inquired if I was still interested in it. And he said, well, you better get on this because the job market for marketing is much earlier than the social psychology market. So in marketing, you apply usually late June, and the market is pretty much wrapped up by Thanksgiving or a little bit after. So I thought I'll give it a shot and see how I do on the market. And if it doesn't go well, that's fine. It might be a terrible decision to do that anyway. But I got a lot of traction and I made the leap. And at the time, I wasn't sure if it was a fantastic decision or a completely terrible decision. Zero regrets. It ended up being one of the best decisions I ever made, in the sense that I'm at a fantastic school with a lot of resources, but I'm also in a field where most people are studying things that are very closely aligned with my interests, things associated with preference and choice and attitude change and so forth. And so it's a much smaller field than social psychology, but one that has a scope that is sort of focused on the kinds of things that I tend to be interested in.
At the time you were applying, did you have work that was specifically marketing work, or were you just kind of like selling a promise? Like,
it was a little bit of both. I had some work that was not at all related to marketing, but my dissertation was, right? So it was on how targeting messages to aspects of people's identity can affect persuasion. And so the dominant finding, or the way people in marketing would think about it, is that, if I appeal to you and your characteristics, let's imagine you're an extrovert, and I say, this product is for extroverts like you, that it's going to be more persuasive to you because it's for you. And that's how people tended to think about it. But as a good elaboration likelihood researcher, I thought, well, there are other ways that this could work, and another way it could work is by making you think more carefully about the content and the message. And so, to the extent that you do that, you'll be more persuaded if the arguments are strong and compelling, but less persuaded actually if they are weak and specious. And that's what I found. And so that was my first marketing publication.
And because those studies were like very much advertisements, right? Like the context was like, this is a VCR. If that, I think that's one of them, right? There's a
Well,
VCR that'll make you the
yeah,
life of the party.
good memory. That's exactly right.
And so, but like, why even entertain? Like something, there was some itch at some point that said, go take some marketing classes. Was that ever like a path you saw for yourself, like at the beginning? Like you sort of, if you're interested in persuasion and you go to grad school to study that, I could imagine that at the same time you'd have been like, yeah, but I could have gone into sales just as well.
I feel like all of my life decisions have been somewhat serendipitous and produced by nudges. I think had I not had the nudge of pursuing that minor in marketing, and had I not had the nudges that I got from people like Joe and Kurt who had made that leap sometime before, I probably wouldn't have done it or wouldn't have had the confidence to do that. And there are certainly some real differences that are probably of less interest to your listeners, but the teaching is quite a bit different. You're often teaching using the case method, and the students are quite a bit different. MBA students are quite a bit different from doctoral students or undergrads, and I do teach doctoral students. But from a research perspective, my life is not at all different from the way it would be in a social psychology department, with except minus the benefit that I don't have to apply for grants, and that my tenure decision was not at all based on my ability to secure grants.
You mentioned the case method. I was looking at your CV and I saw that there's some like case study things. It's one of those things that's like, I know enough people in business schools to know that case studies are an important thing, but I still don't quite understand what they are or where they come from. So this is maybe my chance. Can you tell me, like, what is that? What do you mean when you say the case method?
Oh, yeah. So the prototypical case is based on an actual business situation that a business faced. And so a case would be a description of that context. Here is the business, here are the people, here are the decisions they're trying to make. Maybe it's should we enter this market or not, or how do we increase sales, or whatever the case may be. And you use a sort of Socratic method to help people think about how people ought to make the decision that's in the case. And so I say, Andy, tell me about the customer for this product. And you say, well, they're young males, age 25 to 45, middle income, blah, 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 so on and so forth. And when you teach the case method, you have a series of what MBAs call takeaways that you're trying to draw out of that. And so you're trying to use this real business situation as a means of helping people, I think of it as helping them abstract a way of approaching problems. And this is just a context in which you're showing that approach. But what they're trying to do is use the existing information, learn how to interrogate that information, and to integrate that information to reach a sensible decision. And so the way I think about it is that it's you're teaching decision making, and so one risk of that is that people sometimes want to focus on the locality or the specific, like, this is about FedEx or this is about TiVo, when really it's about how you disrupt a market or something like that. And even more broadly, how do you take a set of information, understand the questions that you need to ask to make a good decision, find that information and integrate that information so that you can make the best, pursue the best course of action given what you know.
And where are the cases coming from? Like, are you like you're building a course? Where do you turn? Are you just opening up the newspaper? Like, where are they coming from?
People write them, and so certain universities place incentives for their faculty to create a lot of cases. I've written a couple of cases; they're not particularly good, so it's hard to find cases that have the pedagogical aspects that you want. That it's teaching lessons that fit in with what you want to accomplish in your course. And like any good story, it needs to have some amount of tension and ambiguity and suspense. A challenge of writing a good case is that a lot of businesses, when you approach them with the idea of writing a case on a certain context, is that they want to appear good, and by that, we're smart and omniscient and always successful. And those are not good cases. Good cases are when companies are in potential trouble and or when they make mistakes or when it's not at all clear what the right course of action is. And so it can be challenging to write a good case. And I think more and more you see cases that are fictional, that they're based on realistic business situations, but don't necessarily pertain to any given company. And that obviously makes it a lot easier to write a good case because you can shape the facts in a way that will present the story or the lessons the way you want them to.
Is there like a drum roll moment where you say, and this is what they decided? Like, is that an important part of it? Or is it really just like the important part is the dilemma that they were in? And, I could see a version where you go like, we're trying to then get to the decision they made is like this, the gold standard. Like, this is what the decision you should have reached. Or do you go, no one really cares? Like they might have gotten it wrong. I just want to present you with a dilemma.
Yeah, students are often very interested in what the company did and whether it was the right thing or the wrong thing. I try to discourage that approach in the sense that in any real world context, there are a million factors that can affect the success or failure of a business in any given situation. And many of those factors may be things that were not even represented in the case. Imagine you're dealing a case with an airline, and an airline's trying to figure out how to increase their market share in some industry. And it turns out the airline made this decision and their profits decreased. But their profits could have decreased because fuel prices went up or something else that's completely irrelevant to the content of the case. And so the focus really is on did you make the right decision given the information you had in the case?
Which, yeah, needn't be the actual decision that they reached.
Well, I could make the right decision, and still other things could interfere. Other things that weren't
Mm-hmm.
presented in the case could interfere to make that a good or bad outcome for me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? For example, you could make a certain career choice that, given the information you had at the time, was the absolute right career choice. But unforeseen events like ChatGPT comes in and destroys that entire industry. Given what I knew before ChatGPT, this particular career choice was the right one, but I didn't have this other piece of information that changed whether or not that ended up being a good choice.
I'm also curious. We're talking about teaching in a business school, and I'm very curious about this marriage of improv and management that you've been facilitating lately. I think I knew a long time ago that you were interested in improv. In college, I did improv for 3 years or so, and have been interested in that world for a long time. And
Yeah.
way back when, I think in college, some like weird blog would pay you money to write articles, and I was like, I'm going to write the article on improv as like a thing in the workplace. Uh, and here you went and fleshed that out, I think, quite a bit more. So can you kind of this is a real tangent, but it's just a curiosity I have. What is this that I think I'm talking about, and where is it going?
Yeah, I do a lot of teaching with that. In fact, I don't use the case method at all anymore because I'm doing this kind of teaching, which is it integrates social psychological theory with and some stuff from cognitive psychology with exercises or techniques from improvisational theater to help people develop their soft skills and to engage in more effective creative problem solving. And so I teach things on topics such as becoming comfortable with spontaneous situations, being comfortable with the possibility of failure, working effectively in teams, modulating your nonverbal behavior or modulating your status, engaging in effective storytelling, maximizing your creativity. And for all of those things, there are things that improvisers do, exercises that they do to respond flexibly in the moment or to create an effective scene that involves shifts in status between the characters. And for also each of those things, there are lots of things that we know from psychology that inform either how you do those things effectively or inform how your mind responds to certain situations that can promote more adaptive or less adaptive responses. And so it's a combination of those two things. We have people do these exercises, and then some of the debriefs correspond to your internal experiences. What did it feel like when you did that exercise? Well, one reason you might feel this way when you do this exercise is because your brain struggles with inconsistency, or when you exceed your optimal level of arousal, you tend to have these kinds of cognitive outcomes. In other cases, it's things like, here's what we know about how people perceive status. And so here are some things that research would suggest will affect your status. We're going to try those out using these various exercises. And when I started doing this teaching, it honestly seemed a little silly or frivolous. I felt a little guilty about it because it was too fun. And it turns out there's an incredible value to people for it. And I find this across all levels of experience. I have had a couple of undergrads in my class, but I do this stuff with very experienced executives, and they're often the ones who find the most value from this. And I feel that all of us have an incredible potential to expand our capabilities in those domains. And when you do it, the results are unmistakable. I'm sure you found this in your own improvisational theater training that it sounds hyperbolic, but it's true. It changes all aspects of your life, the way you approach decision making, the way you approach your interactions, the way you approach your interactions with the world in general. That I feel that it's a very different orientation than many people have before they take the class. And often the people who are least suited for it are the ones who get the biggest growth. If I have someone who's very timid or afraid of spontaneous situations, even in a 6 session class, the growth from day 1 to day 6 is really incredible.
One thing I like about what you're saying too, though, is I'm a person who really resents role playing as like a strategy for like doing stuff. Like, let's pretend you're in a job interview and like I'm going to play the role of the interviewer, and I go like, this is pretend, this is silly, like I can't get a buy-in on this. But if it's presented more as like it's a game, like we're playing games and we're kind of like, here are some rules, and it's not like, everything's on the line, like you're going to simulate exactly what's going to happen in the room. I get the sense that that's more of what you're doing. If it's kind of like, this isn't like a, pretend. It is. I don't know if you understand the distinction that I'm making. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I totally do. And in fact, I don't have, I have almost no business context in the things that I do in the class. Because much like the cases, I'm not trying to teach you how to have a difficult conversation in an interview or how to fire someone or hire somebody. There are plenty of courses about that, and there are context-specific aspects of those components that are very important to know, and those classes teach those components better than I would in this class. What I'm teaching is general principles of how you modulate your status, general principles of how you orient toward failure in your life experiences, general principles of how you tell stories. And so that could take place in a fictional job interview, or it could take place in a simple exercise. And a lot of the exercises are not even role playing or what improvisers call scene work. And as you know from doing improv, you can't take people who have never done these kinds of things before and throw them straight into scene work. There are too many other components that are irrelevant that make that difficult. So we work out by just doing what improvisers call games. And they are fun exercises that don't necessarily involve simulating some kind of interaction with somebody, but rather you're just doing exercises and seeing how that feels. How does your mind respond to that environment, and why? And how can you improve the way your mind responds to those environments?
And where did any of this come from? Why is this something that you're doing?
It started because I took improv classes and I enjoyed it, but I recognized how much it shifted the way that I interacted with other people and my orientation towards situations. At Stanford, the Stanford GSB has a very strong focus on what we call leadership. And a lot of that involves these kinds of soft skills, and no one was doing that kind of thing. So I thought I'll make a compressed course and see if it gets traction, and it ended up being incredibly successful. And I continue to be amazed by the value that people get from it. And I feel like one of the things that makes this course a little different from other things is that rather than just being an improv class, which I think most people could benefit from, but what I try to do is to bring the other side to it, this social, psychological, and cognitive theory, so that you have some theoretical grounding, both in the things that I'm teaching you, but also in making sense of your mental experiences.
If you want to go the Cialdini route and like have a training for like instructors that you then like spread across the country, sign me up because this sounds fun.
Right on.
Okay, so I know you primarily through the work that you do research wise, and in looking when I was thinking about asking you to come on, I was like, okay, like what's the theme? And sometimes I do this as particularly for whatever reason in business schools, folks who do research in that environment, I look at their CV and I go, what's the thing? Like, what's the what's the like main theme to all of this? And there's, I think, more of that with you, particularly because I know that. But even still, I was kind of like, I don't know personally how to thread that needle. And I'm curious to you, like, what is the through line if you think there is one?
Yeah, well, I'll first make a general comment about what you said. I think your impression of business school versus social psychology people is correct, and I think partly that's due to the structure of those different types of research orientations. That social psychologists tend to have a lab, and they tend to have dedicated students who work only with them, and that's typically not the case in business schools. Our students tend to work with a lot of different faculty. And as a result, you tend to have a different kind of student, one who is more of a generalist. It's also the case that before I got tenure, I was much more focused in my research orientation. And since tenure, I allow student ideas to guide my research agenda a little more. And so that has the benefit, I guess, of making me learn lots of different things and pursue a lot of different research areas at the potential expense of making me feel terrified that I don't know literature as well as I used to when I was very focused on persuasion. But I think a through line for most, but not all of the work, is on two things. It's on attitude change and persuasion processes, but also on identity, and so how people's self-views affect those persuasion or attitude processes.
And I think some of the things that we're going to talk about today are, it's actually kind of at the sweet spot of both of those of like, how do I present myself to the world and how does the world see me? And what might that have to do with like the way I engage with other people's attitudes? So let's jump in. So two kind of recent projects that I know are ongoing to me strike me as this central dilemma of what, how do I be a good person without coming across as a bad person? uh, and so one of those examples is, I think, self-control. Looks like there's work on that. And so we think about self-control as this thing that's a virtue, like that's something we might aspire to do is to enact self-control. And it just seems reputationally treacherous. And so I'll hand it off to you. Like, what's kind of the impetus for looking at like the reputational side of self-control?
Yeah, well, so there are lots of interpersonal benefits of having self-control. When we look at people who have high self-control, they have a lot of positive characteristics. They engage in greater perspective taking. They have higher levels of empathy and altruism. They engage in more accommodative behavior. And interpersonally, if I'm going to have you do a detail-oriented task, I'm going to prefer someone with high self-control. I also will prefer people with high self-control if I myself want to exert self-control. So if I'm trying to exercise more, for example, and I know that you are a dedicated exerciser, you have some friendship value for me in that way. But one particular set of benefits that were of interest in starting this particular project are also the notion that you are viewed as more virtuous and more trustworthy and more moral when you engage in self-control acts. So that's part of the basis of it. And then another part of the basis of it is thinking about what self-control is. And I feel not to be too provocative, but a lot of people, even academics, use self-control in a way that I think is a little bit loose in the sense that they may look at your choice between a cookie and an apple, for example, and say, if you choose the apple, you engaged in self-control. But I don't think that that's quite right. That when you think about what self-control is, if you think about the definition of self-control, the definition of self-control is overriding or overcoming some kind of motivational conflict in order to act virtuously. So if I don't like cookies and I prefer apples, that's not an act of self-control. That's just an act of acting on my preference, right? So it's an act of self-control. If I really desire the cookie, I'd rather eat the cookie, but I'm going to resist that for the sake of being a good person, and I'm going to choose the apple. And so this is where attitudes come into to play in this research project, that I need to overcome an attitudinal preference and to choose something else. That's what forms the basis of self-control. And if you look at most instances of self-control that are studied in the literature, they're of a particular type. And this type is what we call resisting self-control. And before I go any further, by the way, I should say this is with my fantastic doctoral student, Samina Lutfiali, and so she was a big driver of this. But resisting self-control is when I desire something, so I have a positive attitude towards this thing that is not good for me, and I resist that to avoid it. And so a lot of people, when they examine how we view people who have self-control, you may say, I really want to eat this piece of cake. I like the piece of cake, but I've chosen not to eat it, versus I don't like the piece of cake, and I've chosen not to eat it. And what you find is that if I like the piece of cake, but I've chosen not to eat it, you view me more favorably than if I didn't like the piece of cake and I chose not to eat it. And so the interpretation there is that that act of self-control makes you view me more positively, and in particular, you think of me as more moral or whatever the case may be. But as you can see in the way I've set this up, is that there's a confound here between the attitudinal position, liking versus disliking cake, and the self-control inference, that they are perfectly correlated in this resisting form of self-control. But self-control doesn't need to be confounded in that way. That there are other forms of self-control that we need to engage in, which I call acting self-control. There are lots of forms of self-control that we engage in to do positive things where I need to overcome a dislike of something in order to do the virtuous thing. I don't want to exercise, but I'm going to do it anyway. I don't want to eat my vegetables, but I'm going to do it anyway. And so there are lots of actions that we engage in where we need to overcome a negative attitude towards doing that in order to make the virtuous choice. And here you can see now in this situation, the attitude and the self-control are perfectly negative correlated, right? That if I dislike the thing, but I do it anyway, that's the virtuous thing. And so we can use this orientation, we can look at these different types of self-control to determine whether self-control is the basis for these positive impressions or whether it's really your attitudinal orientation toward the object. Does that make sense?
It does. I think I was thinking of the confound a little differently, which is that, like, if you like cake and resisted to choose the apple versus if you never liked cake to begin with, do I like you more because you had self-control, or do I like you more because I also like cake and we are the same in that way? Like, we actually agree with each other. That's the thing that I'm responding to.
Yeah, well, it's an excellent point. I'm glad you brought that up very early in the discussion. So, one of social psychology's very robust findings is that we like people who have similar attitudes to us. Attitudinal similarity is a big driver of impressions, and we find that effect as well. In all of these studies, we have controlled for attitudinal similarity and still shown these effects above and beyond that. But certainly that is the case, that
So,
you do find attitude similarity effects.
so like, I like you for two reasons. One, you're a chocolate cake guy, just like I am. Number two, you were able to like say no to it, and that's like a virtuous quality. And so you get like 2 points for liking. Is that kind of
Well,
one way
that
to?
that
Oh, maybe not yet. Maybe I'm jumping the gun.
well, that's what you might think, but as it turns out, that's not true.
Mm,
I like you because you share my attitude. That's one thing. That's a nuisance finding that we have in the data. But I don't like you if you exert self-control. I like you if you like things.
more than if you dislike things.
Exactly. So if you like chocolate cake and don't eat the chocolate cake, I like you more. But if you don't like salad and you eat the salad, I don't like you more. I like you less than if you like the salad and eat the salad. Another way of saying this is we find robust attitude main effects. I like you if you like cake. I like you if you like hamburgers. I like you if you like exercising. And I don't like you if you don't like those things. And we find virtually no effect of self-control across all of these studies. Instead, we find attitude liking effects. And this effect is not entirely novel in the literature. There are a couple of other papers that have shown this. But in the domain of self-control, what you see is that this tendency to focus on resistance forms of self-control have, in some cases, prompted this conclusion that people with self-control are viewed more positively. But in a lot of cases, that may just be due to the person's positivity toward those objects rather than the self-control itself. Does that make sense?
What did you call the opposite of resistance? Self-control?
Acting self-control.
Acting self-control. And that's the thing people don't, they could take or leave, it seems like.
I dislike acting
Oh,
self-control.
actively dislike it.
Yes, and in proportion to your dislike of the object. And so, in some sense, it's inversely correlated with your self-control. So imagine that you're making a choice between a virtuous action. You're going to choose a virtuous action, and you either prefer you do not prefer that virtuous action by a little bit, or you do not prefer that virtuous action by a lot. In that latter case, that would involve greater self-control. But I like you even less for that because your overall attitude positivity is lower.
Uh-huh. I think that example is what I was wondering could be a counterpoint before I knew what your results were, which is like people who are trying to control prejudice, right? You might say like that's an act of self-control where you go like I harbor these biases against this group of people, but I know that the right thing to do is not to act on them. And so I control those impulses in order to be this kind of like virtuous egalitarian decision maker. And it seems like that's an instance that your data would suggest people go like, not into it. Like,
Not into
sure,
it, yeah.
you enacted self-control, good for you, but like the whole premise of this is wrong. Like I disagree with you so fundamentally that the fact that you even had to try not to do that is points against you.
Precisely. Yeah, and if you look at the open-ended comments in some of these studies, people will say things to that effect. We haven't studied it in self-control domains like expressing prejudice. But in domains such as cleaning up your house or eating a salad or whatever, a lot of people are like, "What's wrong with you? You just can't like a salad."
Even someone who's able to do it, right? Like, I mean, that's the irony, it sounds like, is that even someone who's able to go like, God, I didn't want to take a bite, but I ate the whole salad. People go like, whoop-de-doo. Like, I can't even congratulate you for making progress as a person.
Yeah, I like you less than if you just like the salad and eat it. If you like the salad and eat it, yeah.
And like, is there a good explanation as to like why? Like, what is it that people find so distasteful? They just can't get over the hump of you didn't want to do this?
I think we like people who are positive. And if you go back to, even the ash, warm, cold things, I think my liking of things is some cue to my warmth or maybe my positivity as a person. And that I'm not particularly concerned about your self-control, except when it has interpersonal consequences. And so we show that if you engage in an act of self-control to benefit someone else, then all of a sudden, I don't actually find a significant benefit of that self-control in overall evaluations, but I do find that it eliminates your negativity towards the act of self-control.
Is it always the case that the negative attitudes that these targets apparently holds are ones I disagree with? So like you said, you control for similarity, but I almost wonder, is there like a amplification effect where it's just like, or it attenuates it? You go like, I also don't want to eat salad. And so like the fact that you don't, like, I'm a little, I guess it's a question of, does that just like, I give you some extra points, but it doesn't eliminate the distaste I have about this person for not being able to get over it, even though I know I'm the same way.
Could you say that again?
Yeah, so it's more like in these examples when like there's a version of this where it's just valence, right? Like I like people who like things and I dislike people who dislike things. And that's confounded with just like these types of self-control are ultimately just distinguishing between people who like things versus people who dislike things. Versus another version in these examples, you go like, well, the people who like stuff are just more like me in these scenarios, right? Like it just so happens that I do like chocolate cake. And so like, I understand the dilemma that you faced and I don't see the problem with salad. And so like, I think it's a little weird that you had such a hard time, muscling down this salad. But what about someone who would say that it's, I personally hate salad and I completely get why this was such a struggle for you? Is there a version of the story where the similarity of our opinions on this wipes out this negative effect of self-control.
No, no. So similarity doesn't wipe out any of these effects.
Mm-hmm. So even people who would say, I hate salad, still look at this guy who had to exert self-control to eat one, and they go, I don't like that guy.
I mean, you like that person more than someone who doesn't hate salad, but
Right.
you don't like that person more than a target who likes salad.
Huh. So is there like I'm curious about like the implication of this. Like what do you see as sort of like the major contribution that this makes?
Well, I guess I would say it helps us think about self-control and why self-control is a positive feature. That we may think that people like us because we're virtuous or because we have this ability to control our behavior. Um, and people don't, at least insofar as it doesn't affect them personally. Now, again, so long as it has interpersonal consequences for me, for example, that I'm going to benefit from your active self control, that you're going to be a better friend, you're going to be a more reliable roommate who's going to do your share of the housework or whatever the case may be, those interpersonal benefits will have a positive effect on my evaluations. But when it comes to you eating a piece of cake, I really don't care at all. Good for you. Um, Now, again, there are probably lots of contexts in which we care about the outcomes of your decisions in the sense that people tend to evaluate attractive people more positively, and self-control can have a lot of, attractive benefits, whether it's, being wealthier or skinnier or whatever the case may be. But the act of self-control itself I don't care about.
Hmm. Hmm. So the other version of this, of like the things that you would think would have reputational value, but that turn out not to, is this work on receptiveness. And this, I talked to Julia Minson 2 years ago, probably, on this show on receptiveness. So people who are interested can, for the full story, go back to that. But in a brief summary, like what does it mean to be receptive to other attitudes? And like why would that be the kind of thing that people would ordinarily expect is gonna carry these benefits to be this way?
Yeah, so being receptive means that you're willing to seek out, to attend to engage with opinions that are different from your own. And so this is related, obviously, to work on information exposure and attitudes. And so many of us try to avoid information with which we disagree. Receptive people are not that way. They are engaging in an open-minded way with information that they know is inconsistent with their own opinions. And research shows that there are a lot of interpersonal benefits of being receptive. We view those people as being more intelligent, more trustworthy, more collaborative. They're more persuasive. They're less likely to get censored. They have greater collaboration intentions. They elicit more openness. And so it seems like it's very much a positive characteristic that we would have in an individual. And so people who are motivated to be liked by others might seek to be receptive in all domains. And our research suggests that maybe that's not always the case.
And what are the domains that make receptiveness not so rosy?
Well, our domain was the domain of politics. And interestingly, there's research showing that even for political viewpoints, there are interpersonal benefits to being receptive to political arguments or policy positions that you also disagree with. And we had actually started this project before some of that research came out,
Mm,
and were shocked by the number and robustness of studies showing that even in this political domain,
mm,
you get these receptive benefits, when our data were showing precisely the opposite,
mm.
that those who were receptive to inconsistent views were disliked. And so we started hunting around for the difference between our research and this research that had just been published. And the difference, it turns out, is in knowing who the source of the information is. So I'll make this concrete. Imagine that you are in favor of gun control, which is a democratic position to hold. And I am also in favor of gun control. But you say, hey, I want to be open-minded, and I want to attend to and engage with the other side. I want to hear what these anti-gun control people have to say. Um, I might view you positively for that. But if you were to say, hey, I want to hear Mitch McConnell talk about why gun control is a terrible idea, all of a sudden you get the opposite effect, that I view you more negatively for being receptive to that person. And so another way of saying this is that the moment that you have identified the source of this attitude inconsistent as being a member of the out party, that is when receptiveness carries reputational uh, downsides rather than reputational benefits. I like you less rather than liking you more.
Is that an identity thing? Like what is it that shifts? Why is like if I'm as open to the ideas in both instances, what is the special danger of those ideas coming from a different group?
Right. Well, I think the notion is there are multiple ways of thinking about this, but the key driver that we find across all of this is that we view members of the out party as immoral. And when you start consorting with people who I view as immoral, then I then view you as immoral. And there's a lot of work showing, for example, that we use our perceptions of our own group's morality as a basis for feeling better about ourselves. And that may threaten that view. There's also, of course, similar predictions to be made from balance theory and so forth. Um, but this immorality tends to be a very strong driver of these effects. Now, you could imagine other reasons why this might be. Like you might imagine that I would dislike you because I view you as disloyal to the party, or maybe you're more likely to change your mind if you're exposed to these things. Those play some role, but they're not robust. So we can find that effect now and then, but we also find the opposite effect sometimes. But the consistent effect is through this path of morality. And if you look at, for example, research by Pew Research and so forth, the majority of people in one party view the other party as being immoral, and that has had a dramatic increase over the last couple of decades.
So what's the fear? Like this is one of those things where like I share the intuition. Like I get what people are saying when they say like don't just you're not allowed to talk to those people. But rationally I go like, but I don't really get like what do you think's going to happen? Especially if what you're saying is like it's not that necessarily I'm afraid you're going to change your mind. But just the mere fact that you even allowed this person to talk into your ears, like I can't deal with it. Do you have a sense of like what's so like what are people concerned about ultimately?
Well, I think part of the confusion here, and I don't have strong evidence for this, but if you look at a lot of our responses to moral situations, and again, this is one that people view as a moral situation, I think high need for cognition individuals like the both of us try to apply a rational lens to it. And we say, what could possibly happen? But if you look at, a lot of the morality work by Jonathan Haidt and so forth, you find that, well, a lot of these things don't have a rational basis. It's just wrong. Those people are immoral, and you shouldn't be consorting with them, even if there are no terrible consequences of it, even if it's not going to harm my party's chances of winning an election, or even if you're not going to change your mind. The very fact that you would consider exposing yourselves to these immoral people is a bad thing.
It's like a character flaw
Mm.
or something
And
like
maybe I
that.
view you immoral as a result, right? So, I mean, another way of thinking about this effect is that prior research shows that there are homophily effects in information exposure, meaning that you are more likely to expose yourself to information from people who you view as similar to yourself. And if you view these immoral people as similar to yourself, that doesn't reflect particularly well on your character as a person.
Hmm. Yeah, oh, you must see these people differently than I do if you're
Yes.
willing to talk to them or hear them out. Yeah. It to the mechanism question, I'm not drawing a one-to-one comparison, but it reminds me a little bit of isn't there work of like you tell people that here's a sweater. Hitler wore that sweater and people go like, I don't know, something's I feel weird about this sweater, even though you go like it couldn't possibly be anything, and yet people just go like it's tainted with evil. if something similar is happening here, where it's just like, I can't tell you why the sweater's evil, but like, it belonged to an immoral person and now you're touching it. So I'm not I'm not going to be bothered with this anymore. If it's something just as straightforward as that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I certainly think that that could be something that's going on here. I think if you look closely at that work, a lot of that work has shown effects in physical contexts, as you're talking about. So we often believe that physical objects contain essences from their owners or creators. Um, Whether that could very plausibly, I think, extend to the less tangible exposure in the form of exposure to a person's ideas. That would be a bit of an extension of that literature, but I think it could also be something like that. And that is an affective process that's in line with some of the things that I think could be going on.
And in the studies that you're talking about, what is it that people like? What's the scenario that you're painting for people? Like, what are the situations in which you're testing whether people are okay with, uh, you know, cavorting with the other side?
These are they're the most bare bones scenarios that you could imagine. So, a scenario might be you come to me, you're a fellow in-party member, and you say, "Hey, I was on Twitter, or I guess now X, and I came across this platform from a person from the other party, and I wanted to engage with it. I was interested in it." And then you would ask me, "What do you think? What do you think of Andy? What is your impression of Andy?" So it is that bare bones, and we've used a lot of different information exposure scenarios, whether it's a single exposure or multiple exposures, whether it's an in-person exposure or a distal exposure. It doesn't seem to matter what the context is. We've tested this across, I think, 8 or 9 different political issues. We've used both real people who are delivering the information, meaning known political figures like Donald Trump or Nancy Pelosi. We've also used fictional people or even anonymous people who are just described as being representative of their party. And the effect holds up to all of those different variations.
I'm curious about ways to mitigate this because there's a real tension, right? Like there's I think a academic movement of like, how do we address polarization? We like respectfully engage with the other side. Like we engage in a lot of stuff. Listeners of the show will be very familiar with all this because we've talked about it a lot over the last year. Like engaging in high quality listening, having curious conversations, bridging political divides, being receptive to alternative viewpoints. Like all of these are things that like objectively maybe you could argue are good things to do. uh but like what your work is finding is like, yeah, but watch out because your friends aren't going to like it when you start doing that. Is there any sense of like, but if we do it in this way, people will be fine with it? Or does it seem like, well, there's just stormy waters ahead if this is the road forward?
Yeah, well, I guess one thing this research shows, I mean, we replicate those other findings showing that if it's just exposure to the idea, then it's viewed positively. But if it's exposure to a person from the outgroup, that's viewed as negatively. So, first of all, that presents or illustrates a moderator of the effect, right? So, this is about the people and not about the ideas per se. So that's one positive viewpoint. And then the question is, well, how do we deal with these views of people? And I have a better articulation of the problem, I guess, than a solution. But it does seem to me that this is an instance in one of the real pernicious effects of identity. And if you look at our politics, it seems like uh, we see people who have these strong identity effects with their parties, even when their party switches positions on important stances that used to be very important to the party. We've seen this a lot, for example, in the Republican Party over the last 20 years, that if you take a Republican from 1980 and a Republican now and ask their policy stances, they're going to be dramatically different. But yet there's identification with that party. And this is no different from identification with any abstract identity. I know you've talked a little bit about Ohio State football in your podcast, for example, in the episode with Ken. And we continue to identify with things like teams, sports teams, even though the constituents of those teams are all completely different. None of the players for Ohio State now are the players that were there 10 years ago, but people still identify with that abstract identity. And most identities are abstract. They're not the constituents. And so here we could think of the people, or we could think about the ideas, but it's an identification with that broader category. And there can be lots of positive consequences of that. You know, group identities can spur people to competition and innovation and greater performance. But it can also have a lot of negative consequences. And I think a negative consequence here that we're seeing manifested in our own politics is that I want my side to win more than I want any particular outcome. If this really were just arguments about policies, well, there are lots of things that we can work on. But if it's really just I want my team to win, I don't even care what the policy is. I just want you to lose and my team to win. I think that makes it a lot more difficult. And this is exacerbated by the fact that, as other people have noted, that we have a lot of uh, segregation, both physical segregation in where people choose to live. So Democrats and Republicans are increasingly living further apart from one another geographically, or just idea segregation, that social media is serving us information that is information we tend to agree with, and we don't get as much exposure to information we might disagree with. Um, and as a result, it becomes easier and easier to have these caricatures and these inaccurate stereotypes of what the other group is like. Um, but clearly, the answer here is some degree of less identification with my group, or at least less of a desire for my group to win at all costs. And some of my other research does provide some positive hopes for that. So another project I have with Mohammed Hussein, who did this receptiveness project, is looking at how people view anti-democratic behaviors as done by your own party. And what we've looked at here in particular is people who engage in what we call metal ads. So I don't know if you've been following this in the political news. This is a technique more done by Democrats, but what they'll do is a Democrat in the primaries will advertise for an extreme and unelectable Republican in the hopes that that extreme Republican will win the primaries, thereby making it easier for them to win the general election. So if I'm going against this far right extreme person, they might win the primary, but they're not going to win the general election. And so in many cases, the Democrats are spending more on these extreme candidates' primary campaigns than they are spending themselves, often by an order of magnitude. And this can often be a successful strategy, but people to date are not particularly aware that this process is going on. The candidates of their party, these Democratic candidates, have done this. And when you make them aware that those candidates are doing it, they evaluate that candidate more negatively. They're less likely to donate to that candidate. And the reason for this is due to an effect on a variable we call system integrity concerns, which is the notion that if you engage in this behavior, even if it's not strictly against the rules or against the law, there's nothing saying you can't advertise for another party's candidate. That it's inconsistent with the spirit of the system, and that if everyone were to continue to do this, this is a threat to the integrity of the system. And here the system is our democratic process. And so we have this belief that people ought to have an unfettered ability to choose their candidate to run in the election, and this is viewed as inconsistent with that informal rule. And that's what's responsible for the negative evaluations. And if we can highlight the consequences to our democracy, and this is a little bit consistent with Rob Wheeler. I know he was on your podcast recently. He talked about these things too. That if you can make the democratic consequences of these behaviors more apparent to people, that maybe that will make something that will help them pull back. And in this particular case, with the receptiveness, that's mere speculation on my part. But we do know those kinds of things have had positive effects in other domains.
And say again, the intervention would be to do what?
To heighten the reality of these system integrity concerns, the consequences of these behaviors, right?
And I think the stuff that Rob has done, this was in their big contest to save the world, and
Yep.
it was like some video, right, of like places where democracy crumbled, and just sort of like
Exactly.
injecting the fear of like, this could be where we're headed. And that was like one of the most impactful interventions I think that they found. And so and that's the kind of thing that you're talking about, right? Like getting people to care about the integrity of the system.
Yeah, that's my speculation. Now, the challenge for that, I think, is that let's just say I don't mean to pick on the Republican side, but as a concrete example, there are lots of Republicans who genuinely feel that the last election was stolen. And to the extent that they feel that, believing that their team must win at all costs would actually be a means of restoring the system, right? We have to have Trump win the election because he should have won the election last time, and these Democrats are just going to steal it again. The only way to save our democracy could be to undermine democracy. Now, we've tried similar things in that project, heightening the consequences of an election, not quite, illuminating our democracy, but here are all the terrible things the party will do, the other party will do if they get elected. That wasn't enough to make our effect go away. But I do think a lot of this election theft rhetoric has exacerbated this issue and has made these kinds of things even more complicated to resolve.
It cycles back to like if this is only fueling the immorality cycle, these
Yes.
perceptions of the other side. Because one of the things I was thinking about when you were describing that work was it highlights this misunderstanding of political polarization, right? There's this feeling that what we're saying is that attitudes have gotten more extreme, that these policy positions have gotten more extreme. But by the data, that's not quite the story. Really what this is, as you said, is it's an identity story. Like we've locked onto these groups as identities that then fuels these perceptions of immorality. And so maybe part of the solution is also to chip away at these ideas that the other side is just like evil incarnate. And that like only then could we go like, oh, well, then you wouldn't be tainted by talking to them. And you wouldn't be so quick to just like ignore the things that they're saying or to like rush to preserve something that your group holds dear. And in some ways, it might be one of those cases where you go like, what you got to do is like actually engage receptively to debunk some of these stereotypes about, well, anyone who holds a different political opinion as me is definitely immoral. You go, oh, if I actually listen to people, I might go, well, maybe that's not not the case. And that could, this is my lofty solution.
Mm-hmm.
Take it for what it is. And then eventually, right, that sparks a new way of thinking where it's like, oh, then we can like get back to tolerant and respectful differences of opinion and not these sort of wars between identity groups.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the challenge with that, I mean, we know from decades of stereotyping research, is that stereotypes are very resistant to change. And this is particularly difficult, again, given our information silos that we have here. Yeah, so to the extent that we can do that, that's obviously a fabulous thing. But if we can't do that, maybe it's just not being so attached to our own side. I think group identity can be a wonderful thing, but I also think it has a lot of pernicious consequences. And this identification with our groups, I think, is responsible for a lot of the terrible things that are going on in our world, both inside of politics and outside of it.
Well, I will still keep my fingers crossed that I see one day a paper that you're on that solves all of this for us, and I'll be excited to see it. Thanks for taking the time to talk about all this. It was good to catch up.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. This was fun.
That'll do it for this episode of Opinion Science. Thank you so much to Christian Wheeler for taking the time to tell his story and share his recent research. For the research that's actually been published, you can find links to that work in the show notes, and you'll also find a link to Christian's page on Stanford's website to learn more about his work more generally. For more about this show, you can of course head to opinionsciencepodcast.com for past episodes and ways to support the show. Subscribe and follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, any of those places. And yeah, I hope you're well. My summer is officially underway, and I've got a sabbatical over the next academic year, so I'm in pretty good spirits. I'm recording this before I head overseas for a week, so fingers crossed my system of flights and train tickets get me where I need to go. I'll fill you in if anything goes awry. Okay, that's all from me. See you in a couple weeks for more Opinion Science. Bye-bye.